So what's
even his first season, and I lost respect for him because he was his arms also stuck with the showboater and Russell. $10,000 touchdown. And he only did. And he scored that. I don't know. Yeah. Well, all was really going at one. And then he got himself.
what's
down the wrong road.
And I wore warm clothes and now it's warm. I was freezing. Before, now I'm warm.
I always thought you were saying.
Vicky would. Everyone got dressed nice and warm. Look at.
Well, if we have to get a hold of facilities to turn the temperature back down, we can do that.
That's great. Where'd you get that? That's very cool.
Thank you. All right, let's bring the 2022-23 Yamhill County Budget Committee meeting to order.
All right. If it's okay, before we jump into the first round of presentations, there was something, I was contacted by Ken Friday in planning, and there was an adjustment that he was wanting to make to his budget, and he forgot to present that yesterday. So just really quickly, in the interest of on page 33, which is, if you look for the Manila tab for land use, and if you go to Fund 1020, all right, so on page 33, on GL code 1020-402.02, office specialist 2, there's one FTE that's currently budgeted there. And what Ken has requested is we're going to move that FTE and the salary associated with that FTE to a senior office specialist. So the new numbers, I didn't actually do the math, but it's going to take the FTE to 1.75 for a senior office specialist. And then that 37,144 will get moved down to that line. It shouldn't have any impacts on the other roll-ups or the total FTEs or anything like that, but that was a change that Ken needed to have reflected in the budget.
Thank you, Ken.
And thank you. And that's all I had
All right.
just really quickly this morning.
Well, Mr. Barry.
Good morning.
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 Good morning. Well, I am Brad Berry. I'm the district attorney. I'm going to spend a few minutes with you talking about our two budgets. And kind of as a general overview, especially for committee member Fields, kind of where our budgets come from. I wanted to just spend a little time there. I have two budgets in my for my department. They are the 1018 and the 1022 budget. The 1018 budget is generally my criminal office, the criminal division, and the 1022 budget is child support enforcement, the support enforcement division. The funding for the main budget for my main office, for the most part, comes from county general funds. The other revenues that we have two grants that we receive. One referred to as a JRI or a Measure 57 position, which pays for a deputy DA who is dedicated to the Justice Reinvestment Initiative from the legislature, which has now been going on Jessica would know better than I, for 8 years-ish, since 2013. I hit that right very close. Since 2013, and we received supplemental grant funding. This is our third 2-year budget cycle paying for that. So we had that position paid. We also received VOCA funding, which is Victims of Crime Act funding, which pays for some of the cost of our victims' services. But primarily the funding for the criminal office is from the county general fund. The support enforcement budget, the 1022, is really primarily funded with federal funds. So we have the feds pay 2/3 of the costs of that office with a 1/3 match. In addition to the general match funding that we get from the county and the Fed, we get federal incentive monies. These are bonus monies that come to the office for meeting certain goals that the feds set. Those goals have to be met statewide, and then they are divided throughout the state for those offices that provide child support enforcement. And so as you look, as we get to the revenue in the 1022 budget, you'll see that delineated. I always need to point that out just generally so that you have a good feel for where that revenue comes from. But when we are such as we are this year, we don't have any funding issue related to the 1022 budget. It isn't as critical. It's always awkward when we do have funding issues in the 1022 budget, because if we're short by $10,000, I literally have to cut $30,000 to save $10,000 of county revenues. But again, we don't have that issue. It's just good to know that we get significant funding from the federal government related to collection of child support. And just so that you know, we collect, I think currently in excess of $5 million a year for families in Yamhill County and child support. So it's a big benefit to the county for having that locally. We've had challenges there, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but I do want to actually start with the 1022 budget. Ken gave me the page number for the 1018 budget, but not for the 22 budget. So I'll ask him to share with you where we're starting.
We'll just flip through until we see.
Until you find it.
1022.
Page 56.
So as I mentioned, that budget is in very good shape. There are no real changes to it. As you'll note, we are predicting a really healthy beginning balance there. It would really be nice to be able to take some of that beginning balance and move it, but we can't. Those are all dedicated funds that have to be utilized for the payment of child support related expenses. I will tell you that currently we are fortunately going through a remodel in that office, and we're going to be replacing workstations and the like. So I do have some things to spend that money on, but for the most part, we have no real changes. I will tell you that I anticipate now that the projected beginning balance is actually going to increase a little. We recently had the supervisory position there vacated, and that'll probably take us 30 to 60 days to replace that. So we're going to have some additional employment cost savings. Offices, we're in a bit of a struggle now with a brand new case manager and now the supervisor leaving. But these are challenges that every department has from time to time, and we have it. I do want to point out that where we have the federal incentive funds, you'll see that budget line item at 332.04. That's always a bit of a guess. Those are the incentive funds I mentioned that we get paid as a bonus for meeting goals, but it's very unpredictable for us. I try to get as best guess as I can, but again, it just depends on how many states meet the goals that the feds state. Then that pot of money is divided by the states, and then the states divide it up in-house, so to speak, into the various offices. So we always, for that particular amount, I give it the best wag that I can. The other part of it is we are not allowed, we used to be able to use it for, instead of a county match, we could use it as the match for the county. But back in the Bush administration, actually, that was changed, and we're no longer allowed to do that. If we were, then it would become a more critical component because I would utilize it and reduce the draw on the county, but I'm not allowed to do that anymore. So it's a fairly small budget. It's only complicated by how the revenue comes in, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that before I move to the 1018 budget.
Sure.
Yes.
Brad, does the child support enforcement money come in late? Is that why it's currently so low?
Yeah, we get paid for the last quarter.
Okay.
And we get paid quarterly on it. We actually submit a statement quarterly that then is reviewed and reimbursed for the 2/3 of what the costs were. So yes, it always comes in late, and it's always a bit of a calculator coming off of, as we go into July 1, we come off of Q3 for the feds because the feds are on the October to September 30 fiscal year. And so it's always a little bit awkward on how I calculate some of that. But because it comes in so routinely, I never get particularly concerned that we won't get a payment, for example. And as you can see now, we have plenty of cash on hand. I don't have to worry about somehow overspending before the match repayment comes in.
And just a reminder on that year-to-date column, that's not a true year-to-date. It doesn't reflect today's date. That's when this report was run.
Okay.
And in order to build these binders and put them together, we've run this report several weeks ago. So those year-to-dates don't reflect just current year-to-date.
Okay.
And we did just bill. So our Q3 ended March 30, then we bill by April 30. We have to bill by the end of the month, and then we'll get paid sometime over about the next month. So to answer your question directly, Commissioner, we're about 60 days behind the completion of the quarter before we get paid for it.
Okay. Thank you.
So now I want to move to the 1018 budget, and thank you, Mr. Hupfer. That starts on page 54 of your budget book. This budget annually is a struggle for us. We are primarily funded through county general funds. Just to kind of reiterate what I said before, we do receive some VOCA funding, and we do receive funding for a deputy DA position, the Measure 57 prosecutor, from the Justice Reinvestment Initiative monies. This year, the allocation given to us increased by 3% over last year's county allocation. Just generically, we are about 86% of my budget is personnel, and our personnel costs increase, as the commissioners are well aware, and the budget committee members who are returning. We have cost increase for personnel that are about 6%. So we're always a little bit behind. On the years where I have not had to submit a balanced budget with cuts, we've done so because we've had a pretty healthy beginning balance that we've carried over. And that's normally been in years where we have had vacant positions frequently through the year. I think the commissioners are well aware, I always slow hire in the 10-18 budget so that we do save money when we're short. And that has helped reduce or helped increase whatever beginning balance we have in the next year. This particular balance budget does, as I have done the last several years, I had to submit a balance budget that has 2 FTE cut. One is an administrative support position and one is a deputy DA position. And I will talk more about those as we get into the add back process. The overall remaining budget is basically unchanged except for small tweaks here and there, unchanged from what we did for 21-22. I do wanted to point out a couple of things, a couple of fix-it things on it. The in line item 400.20, it says Crime Victim Services Director. That should probably be titled Supervisor rather than Director because we've had a change on how that position looks. It is also shows as it's as a range 17. I've had discussions with Ken about matching that with the supervisor position in support enforcement so that both should be a 19. We have budgeted in both the 10-22 budget and the 10-18 budget as a 19. So one, I lose track of which is which. It's a 17 currently, but we want it as a 19 and it's budgeted as a 19. So the money amounts there are for a 19. And that would bring it in line with the 10-22 supervisory position, which is also a 19. Ken, did I say that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to track. What was the GL code that you said that we need that's currently?
So it's a 401.20,
Okay.
10-18. And the only other thing I did want to point out there is that the FTE is
And-
actually listed in 401.28.
And where did you want it moved?
It should be moved to the 401.20, that FTE.
It should be moved to 401.20.
Correct.
And it's currently budgeted where?
The budgeting amount is in 401.20.
Mm-hmm.
The FTE though is listed in 401.28.
We don't see a 2-0.
Yeah.
I see a 40160.
I'm sorry, 40160.
That must have been what you said.
Yeah, it's just, that's why I have the people who know what they're doing right close by. I'm sorry. So 40160.
Okay.
So then it seems probably the better way to go is the 66,196 expense under 40120 should be moved to the 401.60. Right?
I'm seeing that as a
The other way around?
That's how it is.
Okay, 20, leave it in 20. All right. I'm here to create confusion. So
You're doing a great job.
thank you. Thank you. They do have a no drinking policy in the office. I'm going to have to change that, I think. All right. So if I can, then I'm happy to take any generic questions about the budget. If there's any other things that you had specific questions about before I get into the add back requests.
I do have Brad, Chair,
Yes.
Chair, and then Brad. Sorry. So can you remind me where the funding shows up in the revenue side for the GRI funded
Yes,
EDA?
it's called state enhancement.
Okay.
33413.
Okay, got it. And it looks like it's considerably more than what was budgeted for last year.
Well, we had an increase in I'm trying to remember now when the new supplemental, I'm going to go back to Jess, our new grant started in October of 2021. And it was an increase over the GRI supplemental grant from the prior biennium. you may or may not recall that when we submitted the grant application for JRI funding for the prior biennium, they only funded us at 80%. And this time I again applied for 100% funding, and that was granted. So that was the increase that we received from the JRI funding from the last biennium to the current biennium
Right, so it's a full funding and it's also for a full.
for 2 years, correct?
Okay.
Okay, so here's where I need to just share a little bit about impacts that we've had on our office. We have been running very warm in the sense of very high caseloads for the deputy DAs for several years. As you are undoubtedly aware, crime rates nationally and locally are on the rise. Our referrals to the office remain high, our filings remain high, and we have a significant backlog. In other words, our caseloads are bloated because of the backlog created from the pandemic, where we were unable to really process cases. And as would be expected, many of these cases were set for trial because they couldn't go to trial. So from the defense perspective, delay is almost an advantage. From our perspective, it is not. But there are a lot of cases now that we have set for trial. As I was mentioning earlier, I think to Denny, we are back to regular scheduling. We're running 2 trial courts a week now, which puts tremendous pressure on our personnel, but it does begin to start to relieve some of our backlog, which we need to get these cases moving, and we want to get them moving. Other things have happened, though, that have put additional pressures on the office. You're probably familiar with the term expungement. It really is a misnomer when we talk about adult cases. Technically, they are motions to set aside record of arrest and conviction. Expungement is a term that really is limited to the juvenile system, but either way, it eliminates a prior record. The legislature passed some sweeping legislation that broadened the ability of those who have been convicted of crimes to petition for relief, petition for to set aside records of arrest and conviction. And those are hitting us. They require staff time and attorney time to review. And I will just tell you, just so you have some idea how much broader the net is currently. In all of 2021, we processed 114 petitions to set aside records of arrest and conviction. By April 27th, we have 121 filed this year. We're on a path to do over 500 this year, which, as I was just preparing my notes for this morning, made me realize that's almost a full-time position, having to deal with those expungements, those set-aside requests all by themselves. So it's a huge impact on both staff time and on attorney time. Additionally, Senate Bill 819 provided for a process whereby defendants who are serving sentences can petition my office for resentencing. I'm not going to go into the details unless somebody has questions about it, but essentially it is a process where we developed a method by which somebody can apply for that. Those then come into the office, have to be reviewed. We look at the prior conviction. We have victim contact. If we're considering anything, we have victim contact. I will say that we don't reach out to victims on cases where upfront we wouldn't even consider a resentencing request. There's no reason to ring that bell, obviously. But we are getting those, and they require a fairly lengthy review on that. Again, more processes coming to us. We have, my staff works tremendously hard. I think as members of the community, we can be proud of the work that they do. It is above and beyond, but even saying that, we are unable to keep up on the daily tasks. To me, data is important. I know the commissioners are aware of the evidence-based decision-making. We utilize data to drive decisions. I have a system that's capable of giving me all kinds of data and giving me, for example, how long does it take us on average to conclude a particular case. The problem is I don't have staff time to keep my data up to date and accurate. And so it really is, it's a catch-22 for me when I attempt to implement changes which will make us more efficient. I don't have the ability to determine whether or not that actually works or not, because I don't have the back end ability for that. That's above and beyond just the daily tasks that the staff are asked to do. And now as we're breaking back out into trials, their daily duties get set aside as they deal with the fire, which is today's trial, that they need to be aiding the lawyers with. So I can kind of, in sum, we have the tools, but we don't have the staff. Our caseloads for years have been heavy. Both the lawyers and the staff just continue to take on more and more. We work to be as streamlined as we can, but literally we are a reactive job. We have to do what comes in the door to us, review it and prosecute it as we do. A little history. I took office on December 16th of 1996. In 1997 or 98, I'm getting old and I can't remember exactly which year, we increased our lawyer staff by 1. I ran originally on at least a part of my platform was increasing response to domestic violence cases. And the first thing I asked commissioners back then was for an added position for a dedicated domestic violence prosecutor. And we've continued to have that position to this day. The only other attorney that we've had since 1996 is the grant position, the JRI funded position. We've had no other increase in deputy DA positions at all since that time. Staff has increased by a couple through those years, but that too, we have not. So in a time from 1996, when I think we had a population in the county of around 64,000 to 2022, where we have a population in the county of what, 110,000, if I'm not mistaken, 60% increase in that. We've had almost no increase in staff to respond to that within the office. My add backs are basically 2 pairs. The one is to reinstate the 2 positions that were cut to submit a balanced budget. That, I'm sure you have my memorandum that I prepared for you. That is a cost of $192,000 and change, so to speak. And we're asking for the first time in over 20 years for additional DDA and support staff position funding. Note, we are dealing significantly with a huge backlog. We're dealing with increased filings in the office. And candidly, it's time that we support the office in a way that we can continue to meet all of the challenges that come through the door, both those from what the sheriff's office does and all our police agencies do in the county, as well as the increased work that comes to us from Salem just on day-to-day changes. So those are my requests. You have the amounts of the requests there in front of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
To start us off. So thank you for that history of it. I admit that I actually don't really remember a lot about 1998 either.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'm not going to ask you why. I had my hair was the color of Justin's back then, so yes.
I would love to know how many of your DDA positions are filled right now, and I apologize because it's hard to switch between. I think there's 3 different places where you have DDA.
Yes, I have a total of 11 deputies. So I have a chief deputy, which is Kate sitting behind me. Then we have 1 deputy assigned to the juvenile department. Technically, that position is in Jessica's budget, not in my budget. And then we have 1 lawyer assigned to this child support. We have 2 lawyers who are doing misdemeanor work. Those are our heaviest caseloads, candidly. They are our entry level and extremely high case counts. And then the other lawyers are doing felony work. I have a lawyer who's responsible for the expungements, and we have other delineations, for example, forfeiture counsel. As I mentioned, we do post-conviction, we do fugitive, all different kinds of things, and we have dedicated assignments for some of the deputies, but primarily I have 2 doing misdemeanor work, the rest doing felony work.
And then how many position authorities do you have?
11. Well, in my office, in the 1018 budget, I have 9. The chief plus 8. Well, if you're looking for them, it's probably easier because I have the chief position.
Oh, you.
I have
deputy.
I have 2 DDA 1s and then 6 DDA 2s.
Okay, so you have all of them filled right now.
All of them are currently filled.
Which I in my brief time here is a rare thing, it feels like. It feels like sometimes you have one or two or.
We've gone in streaks. I remember one time we went down 4 lawyers. But I had somebody out sick. I had 2 leave and 1 go to the bench. So it was a lot of pressure on us. But we probably, if I were just anecdotally, we probably lose a lawyer on average every other year. We had a couple who who ended up in the defense consortium when that funding significantly increased. One had left to the AG's office and then almost immediately came back to do that. And we had another one leave to that position. Over the last year, we had, I think Kevin left in last year, right? We had a deputy who went to do defense work in Eastern Oregon. And that was our last change. And our hire, Alexa Bailey, is my newest attorney in the office and took Kevin Imhoff's position.
Okay, and then so it's 192 to restore the positions that you literally had to cut out of the budget.
Correct.
And then you're requesting, and in addition to the 192, 215 in order to have a DDA and a support staff.
Correct.
Correct. In addition to that, okay. And then my last question for the moment is, can you point to in your budget where the remodel is? Because we've gotten the contracts for different steps of it.
Right.
I wanted to check to see, do you have more in it? And can I see where the spending was?
The remodel never happened in the office. However, we are replacing the workstations, which I had money set aside for. I think actually Commissioner Bershauer commented, well, we can't have a remodel without expecting to have furniture. And so we are literally spending that as we've had the design people have been out. I actually expected to have the estimate by today, but we didn't. So there was in the 1018 budget, we had 90,000 set aside for furnishing. So we will be tearing down, well, most of our cubes are falling down, but we will be tearing down the staff system. I've been working with Joe. They're going to come in and replace the carpet when we've got it. And then we'll be replacing all those workstations. That funding, you probably see it's unspent that's in there under equipment. I'm not looking at the right sheet here, but we have 90,000 anyway set aside for furnishings that we will be spending this year, or it'll be first thing in the next fiscal year. But I'm not asking for any, with the overall planning for campus facilities. I don't want to speak for Ken and Justin, but I think everything's kind of on hold right now for major remodel projects, and that we were a major remodel project.
But correct me if I'm wrong, we approved a significant amount for architecture fees, right? For the remodel? But it wasn't never spent.
No, it
No.
was never spent.
No, we've
Well,
been
there was
spending.
some spending on the.
There
by
was
the architects,
architecture
yes.
services.
Yeah,
we
did
that
have
there
that.
there was money
Okay,
spent,
We approved it, I know.
but again, that's not going to be reflected in 1018. That's going to be reflected in Fund
Got
4027,
it.
which is our capital reserve fund.
Okay. Because it was directed to you, but it was in the capital.
Right.
Correct. The only funding that I had in my budget was for furnishings.
Okay. It is now. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it for my questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I said that though 2 minutes ago.
So Ken, is that what 780.01 is, building reserve? Or is that the furnishings?
That's, are you still in 1018?
1018, yeah.
No,
Okay.
building reserve is an internal charge that's charged to
Oh.
all departments for collecting for rent, and a portion of that goes into 4027. It's an internal service charge where everyone pays into 4027 and 4016 for facilities and for future capital improvements.
Okay. I must be missing the furnishings, but.
The furnishings are down in the 800 series because it's a capital purchase. So if you get to the very end, you'll see office furniture, office equipment, department equipment purchase. It's 1018, 800.01, 0.02, and 0.04 on page 55.
Okay, so
And-
that's the balance of 105.
105 is what was budgeted for this fiscal year.
Okay,
And that's where normally I have about 15,000 that I keep in there, which is what I budgeted for 22, 23. Candidly, that covers odd things. I always have that in there in case my copier crashes, because that's going to cost me 15K. So that's where I've always had that number. And we had the additional funds you'll see under the current budget is where the 90 is that I discussed.
Can you tell me the GL code?
It is, so it's under 800, 01, 02, and 04.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just not seeing a 90,000 in the current.
Look at the current, if you look at the
This year's.
Well, I can see
adopted-
that, but that's 105. So I just not seen 90,
It's
that's all.
It's 105 because you take 15 that I normally have in for unexpected, and then the 90 that was allocated for the new furnishings. Okay, that's where the total comes to 105.
Okay, and then I will say that since you didn't spend 105 in this, you have not yet spent in this fiscal year, that's essentially reflected then in your proposed beginning balance, right?
No, because I'm
Oh, no.
expecting that we will write those checks before this fiscal year ends.
Oh, okay.
Or immediately into the next fiscal year. So it will not be available as beginning balance for 22, 23.
That may
Okay.
require a change because if the funds are not going to be spent this fiscal year, in order to spend them in the new fiscal year, we'll have to adjust the beginning balance and bring those funds forward. Otherwise, you
Okay.
won't have the appropriation authority in the new fiscal year. So that's
Yeah.
something that, that we run into from time to time as we go through the budget process. That sometimes we have plans and they may not get spent. And so that may require a further adjustment prior to adoption, depending on where we're at with that project. So that could result in an additional 90,000 being added to the beginning balance and then appropriated down below prior to adoption, depending on the timing.
And is that a June tweak? We'd look at it in June to see if we spend it or
Yes,
not.
it could be, but I also have to be mindful and keep an eye on the total amount and how much of an adjustment we're making because it can't exceed, and I got a lot of numbers bouncing through my head right now. But there are limitations with Oregon budget law and how much of an adjustment we can make to an approved budget without reconvening the budget committee. So I'll have to circle back unless the committee wants to get together again in June, which is but in all serious, we'll take a look at it and there goes the mic again. So now I have to talk really loud again. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. And then when we get closer to budget adoption or into the next round, if it looks like the funds are not going to be spent by June 30, we'll just have to make that further adjustment.
Just timing wise, they were telling us 5 to 6 weeks from order. So I'm expecting that the estimate, the quote will be coming in and we'll likely spend it before we get out of June, but I'll try and keep that on your radar.
Is that something we can make a motion right now and just give the approval to move it in so that we don't have to, if we're just talking about furniture that needs to be spent in the next few months, can we do something right now that gives it the ability to?
Not really, because at this
Okay.
point, because when it comes time to actually vote on the changes, that's tomorrow. So today we would make the changes and then any motions, I guess my team, we can do some follow-up with Brad's office and find out exactly where we're at and the timing of it. And if it looks like we need to make that adjustment, we can be ready by tomorrow.
Chair, I have a question.
Yes, Commissioner.
Brad, thank you, and thank you to your team. Appreciate
Thanks.
your work. I know it's been very stressful lately. Can you go back to the Senate Bill 819?
I
with the
can.
Petition for resentencing. I know when you were here last time, you were giving us a little bit of background on how that has impacted your office. So my question is, since we know that, what happens at the state doesn't stay at the state, and that if we're not engaged at the county level, we can't advocate for situations that you're facing. Was there significant advocacy, and was the legislature fully apprised of what this would mean for your office?
A couple of things. So if we take the two big things that I mentioned, the change in set aside, the widening of what can be set aside, that has been a much bigger impact on our office than I had anticipated. I knew it would be some, but that's actually been one that has been a huge time. As far as 819, we're talking, 121 of the set asides have come in already this year versus 114 in all of last year. Well, on the 819, I've had about 12 to 15 petitions on 819. I have a spreadsheet keeping track of them. I just don't remember specifically. I've had almost all of those land on my desk, so it's increased what I do, and the lawyers have to pick up some of what I normally do to review those. Two things about that I think are important. One, it's totally within the control of the district attorney. So it's not like you file a petition in court and then we have to fight out whether or not it is. The defendant, actually, the incarcerated person, petitions me for resentencing. Then where was it going with that? So I look at all those related to how they come in and make the review of those on it. So far, I've reviewed all, but I think I have two I haven't looked at yet. And only one have I agreed to resentence on it. The interesting thing about this is before 819, there was no mechanism in the statutes to correct a wrongful sentence. Now, I'm using that term intentionally. We had a case many years ago now where we tried a woman on child abuse charges. She was convicted, went to prison. And then about 3 years later, we got word that all three of the children were recanting what they said happened and said that they'd been put up to telling what they did. It was no legal mechanism for me to bring her back to court. I did it. I filed a motion. She was transported back to court. Within 10 days of me finding out about that, we had her out of prison. But there was no legal mechanism other than a defense attorney who agreed, I agreed, and the judge went along with correcting an injustice. Nobody's going to complain, right? But there was no legal mechanism for that to occur. 819 provides us now with that legal mechanism. So this is kind of a roundabout way, Mary, of saying that I supported 819.
Okay.
Had they done it in a way that you could just file a petition and you have to rebattle sentencing every time, I would have so actively opposed that. That's just so wrong for victims, so wrong for a system where at some point you need to close the file and we move on to the next one. And I just can't imagine how we would re-victimize victim after victim after victim if in fact a defendant had that ability. So we're the gatekeeper
Okay.
on those cases.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
Mhm.
I promised that I was done with questions, but this one's going to be directed mostly at Ken because I don't remember. But so in looking at the last year's discretionary allocation and then this year's initial allocation and then the 3% leading to the proposed allocation, the initial allocation is lower than last year's discretionary allocation. Can you remind me why that was?
I can.
Okay, great.
Well, actually, it's tied to the discussion with the office
Yeah,
equipment.
it was
The
the
90,000, which was a
Okay, because
one-time
I was like, I'm pretty sure
discretionary.
this is 90,000, but
Yeah.
great.
Right, that 90,000 was a one-time request. And so that was for that fiscal year. And then that came out of the allocation, the initial allocation.
Perfect. That's very
Correct.
helpful. Thank you.
I had a reinstatement request last year also because they submitted a budget with cuts.
Yeah.
But then I also asked for the 90,000. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Brad, can you give us an example of the new parameters of the set aside petitions?
Probably not sufficiently, but May
maybe-
Chow is the one in my office who deals with almost 100% of those.
Okay.
When the expungement statutes, and again, I'm using the wrong term just for the ease of saying it, the expungement statutes were all over the board. It really, it's some of the most poorly written legislation that was out there before. And there were work groups for, I think, 6 years trying to come up with a plan. Well, this last session, it just got pushed through. And it opened the door for probably 500 or 600% more cases that were subject to the court's ability to set aside the record of arrest and conviction. It's just a huge increase in what can. I personally did not support it because it was too broad. I mean, really, again, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, we're rewriting history. When you say suddenly that this didn't happen, right? We essentially locked down the records of arrest and conviction. And so now somebody comes in the door and they may well have prior convictions, but we don't know it because it's now been sealed.
So it's not necessarily the type of crime that changed or the date, maybe?
Both,
Okay.
all of it. Yeah,
All of
all of it. Well, the dates were always kind of the same. If you have more than one conviction, you have to wait 10 years. And so they
Right.
didn't change a lot of that.
Okay.
It's the door that really opened was the numbers and types of convictions that would be subject to a set aside. There's
Okay.
still some that are not,
Mhm.
but there are a lot more now than there used to be.
Thank you.
And there is a benefit, if I picked up when I was 20 years old, a theft conviction, and you live your life right after that, I
Mhm.
mean, you shouldn't have to carry that backpack for the rest of your life. At some point, we should be able to relieve people of that burden. And that's absolutely fair. But at some point, this doesn't prohibit you from setting it aside, getting another conviction, setting that one aside. It's the way it's open now. We really, when we talk repeat property offenders, if you time it right, you cannot be a repeat property offender because you've set it aside. And now you go do it again, and you can set that aside and go do it again. I don't know if I don't think that was an intended consequence, but it certainly is a consequence.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I had one follow-up question on that, just interested. In the expungement statutes, when they change that and these cases flood your office, is there a time frame that the state mandates on that as well? If there's 500 people that come to your office, do they actually put a time frame that you have to deal with these? Or can you just put them in line and say, we'll get to them when we get to them?
Well, the petitions come into us they have to be fingerprinted. So they come in with fingerprints. Then that's sent off, the fingerprints and I think they might have eliminated the fee, but goes off to OSP for a check because there has to be certain timeframes between conviction and the request to set aside. So then they run the background check to determine that in fact, there have been no other convictions in that timeframe or disqualifying convictions. So that all happens. But at the time the petition comes to us, it's also filed in court. So at some point, the court's going to put that on for a hearing. That becomes our timeframe.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, I have another question. I'm so sorry, but this is an important one, I think. And it's primarily to Ken again, but it's probably for both of you. Which is that in thinking about this, this is about 400,000 of the 2.3. It's a request for about 400,000 of our 2.3 million that we have not yet allocated to discretionary. And some of it is add back reinstatement and some of it is new. What does next year's budget look like then with the initial allocation?
My recommendation would be is to hear all the add back requests.
Yeah.
And then when we have deliberations tomorrow, I'll be better prepared to answer those specific questions
Okay.
because you're going to have that in front of you on your deliberation sheet on what each funding request, if approved, what that impact would look like.
Okay, great. Because I want to make sure, are we talking to 0.355 million plus 192 or 2.35 million plus 400 for next year? Or are we looking at 2.355 million for next year and you suddenly have to find money for 4 new positions within that? So I just want to make sure.
That would be just for clarity, it's 2 new positions and reinstatement of 2 positions.
Yes, but if we fund them, are we looking at you having to find funding for all 4 of those in a budget that only goes back to that initial allocation?
Mhm.
Or do we start you off next year at 2.77?
That's why we do annual budgeting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right, any further questions? Thank you, Ms. Berry.
Thank you for your consideration. Thanks for the
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
So we have Jessica next.
Yep, Jessica? Yes, welcome. I already read this. And then I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Thank you. Welcome, Jessica.
All right, good
Welcome.
morning. Good morning to the Budget Committee and the Commissioners and Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to present the DCJ budget to you. My name is Jessica Beach for the record, and I oversee our Yamhill County Community Justice departments, which includes an adult parole and probation division, a juvenile probation division, a 24-bed juvenile facility, work crew, and pretrial release program.
Move your microphone a little
Little
closer.
closer. You got it. All right, so before I begin, which we're going to start on page 58 in your booklets, I'd like to point out two handouts other than my organizational chart. The first is entitled Department of Community Justice Adult State Revenue Projection. And just wanted to explain a little bit about how Senate Bill 1145 funds work that are allocated from the Department of Corrections for the supervision of felony justice involved individuals. So here you note the 2021-23 because our state funding comes to us on a biennial basis. We're very fortunate this year because it's the middle of that biennium, so I know what my budget's actually going to be, which quite frankly, every other year when I don't know, it's a bit of a juggling game. I do the best that I can to guess. So here you see the statewide total and the Yamhill County allocation, which is determined through the Department of Correction budgeting process. So basically that says that for the 21-23 biennium, Yamhill County basically supervised 2.3% of the statewide population, felony population. So there to the right, then you see the biennial and then the fiscal breakdown for what that amount was allocated to Yamhill County. And then you'll see that the funds are divided between grant and aid and then Senate Bill 1145. And then furthermore, that the Senate Bill 1145 is then separated into what supports the jail for housing of these individuals. So just for those that are not familiar with Senate Bill 1145 that passed in 1994 and allowed for Department of Corrections justice involved individuals to be housed in local jails as opposed to go to an actual institution. So anyone serving a year or less. And so that provided funding to those local jails. The other piece of that funding that you see to the left is DCJ related for my adult POs. And that basically is the transition planning that goes into planning for the release of these folks as far as housing, treatment, basic needs, developing what the conditions of supervision will be. And so there's that second piece. So all of that just to illustrate to you that, that the Sheriff's Office approximately receives 25% of the state allocation from those Senate Bill 1145 funds. So the other handout that I was going to show to you is entitled Yamhill County Department of Community Justice Fund 21 Budget Overview. And so currently we have approximately 5 budgets in Fund 21, which is what we'll go through first before we get to our juvenile budgets. And if I hadn't mentioned it before, approximately 93% of the funds that support Fund 21 are from the state and 7 from general county allocation. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and begin. And please feel free to ask questions as you go through. I'm intending to just highlight changes overall, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask as we go along. So starting on page 58, So there is our beginning balance. I will mention to you, it looks a bit inflated for two reasons. We did have approximately $20,000 in Department of Correction Measure 57 funds that we carried over into this next fiscal year. And we do also have coronavirus emergency supplemental funding, grant funding that we can spend through January of 2023. And so that is represented in this beginning balance number. So, and as I mentioned, because I'm going to point out to you some changes in revenues as we go through the budget, simply because last fiscal I had to guess as to what our actual state funding was going to be. But now that I know it, I can actually make those changes accordingly. So moving on to page 59 is the first fund, 2141. And as I explained with my first handout, this is the designated Senate Bill 1145 funds that go to support the jail. So you see there the revenue. And again, there is a bit of a change there simply because I guessed. And we actually did better than I guessed, which is a good thing. So currently in personnel, this continues to support 3 topped-out corrections deputies. So no changes to report there. And materials and services remain the same. Moving down into the reserve line 99003, which is reserved for personnel expense, we have 61,000 that remains. Any questions on Fund 2141?
I just have one. So are you planning to add another staff member in a future year, which is why you have the reserve?
In
Or-
this particular, well, I'm going to look to the sheriff because he and I actually built
That's
this
right.
together.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what his plans are. Just to save it. And
Okay.
I'm assuming with, roll-ups and whatnot. And again, as I mentioned, these are topped out folks. So.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, moving on to page 60. This is Fund 2144, and this is the county general allocation that Yamhill County and the Board of Commissioners provides to my department that supports misdemeanor supervision. I will mention, and we are very fortunate in Yamhill County that we have commissioners that support the supervision and funding of this type of supervision. Not all counties in the state receive that support and unfortunately have to make really hard decisions about cases they can and cannot supervise because they're just not funded for them. Although there was a bill that passed that did provide some state misdemeanor funding for approximately 3 offenses, sex offense and domestic violence. This still provides us the ability to supervise other felony offenses that we aren't funded by the state for. DUI, for instance, menacing, those types of crimes. So there you see our revenue. And this continues to support 2 probation officers. And typically we put our 2 newest officers in this particular budget. No other changes to point out to you in personnel unless there are questions. And down in materials and services, also pretty much the same. We are hoping to be able to return to some type of pre-COVID travel and training at some point. So there are a couple lines that haven't been spent out of, but that's why. So moving on, any other questions about Fund 2144?
I'm sure I just have a quick question. Well, maybe it's not so quick, but what the changes with pretrial that are coming or that you're instituting, how does that affect parole and probation? Does it, maybe it doesn't have an effect? I'm assuming it has effect on like the work crews and that kind of thing. So can you give a brief overview on how you think that might affect your team?
Well, I can certainly try with my magical glass, right? So currently in Yamhill County, pretrial is housed under community corrections. And so it's hard to anticipate what changes may occur. I've been working really closely with Judge Easterday. And my understanding is the Chief Justice just approved the framework that should be used statewide, and then each presiding judge then determines what their own will appear to be. I don't know that it's going to have a great deal of effect on my office. The only thing that could potentially change would be how we utilize justice reinvestment funds. At some point, if the move is to place pretrial justice under the judicial department, which is very, very common, quite frankly, this is a judicial requirement, then it's possible that justice reinvestment funds could be utilized by my department in a different way, or by Yamhill County in a different way. There's always that possibility. I don't know that pretrial, this bill will have anything to do with work release, because work release and work crew only pertains to sentenced adults in custody. And of course, pretrial folks are folks that have not yet been convicted of a crime. So I don't think there'll be a huge impact. Per Brad Berry's comment of getting through the backlog, my hope is that, you know, as the cases get resolved, that may lead to additional eligible adults in custody that could potentially be used for our work crew program, which we've seen diminish terribly. We maybe have 2 or 3. And I know, you know, I've worked with the sheriff and the jail captain very closely, and they're very supportive of the program. We just don't have the bodies.
Okay, so my assumption was the ripple effect down would be maybe more attention paid outside of the jail. But in fact, there might be no shift that way, or and
Well,
it's hard to predict, but
It is hard to predict. If I understand your question correctly, I think that this bill will ultimately lead to the release of more folks on pretrial status who can safely be managed in the community. But again, those folks aren't yet convicted of a crime, so they wouldn't be eligible for work
true,
crew.
so no
per
impact
se.
on that. Okay,
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
absolutely. Moving on to page 62. And this is our Fund 2145. So this is the bulk of our State Department of Corrections grant and aid funding. It also incorporates the Measure 57 funds that I mentioned, which allows for supervision of property and drug justice involved individuals. And this also incorporates our grant funds, specifically our justice reinvestment grants, which you've heard both Brad and I speak to. So I will point out there is a bit of a difference in revenue on line 33413. And again, that is just based on our best guess for the last fiscal year, and that we actually did better than we anticipated via the legislators. I will also point out to you line 34205, probation fees. There was a legislative change. The passage of Senate Bill 478 stated that community corrections departments could no longer charge probation fees. So you do see a significant drop there from the last adopted budget, but we still are able to collect DOR fees on very old cases that were closed previous to the passage of that new law. Any questions on revenue? Moving down into personnel, no changes to point out to you. You will see some FTE in this budget, and then the other part of them in our Senate Bill 1145 budget, which I'll point out to you. And we do have one position, our office specialist tech, that is dedicated 0.5 in this budget, and then 0.5 in our 1074 juvenile probation. She works as our victim advocate. Any questions on personnel? Moving into materials and services. You do see a couple elevated lines here, central supplies, for instance, contract services. And again, that's with regard to the corona virus emergency supplemental funding that I mentioned that we need to spend before January of next year. Again, just a couple other things with regard to training, hoping that we'll return to pre-COVID, but that may be why you see that previous fiscal year monies were not spent. Any questions on 2145? Moving on to page 64, Fund 2163. So this department supports the work release, work crew, and community service programs. This program is co-administrated between myself and the sheriff, so it's very close partnership, and is supported primarily through the state Department of Corrections funds and highly on contracts, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. So moving into revenue, on that first line, I actually do have a requested change on 34203. Currently, you see it listed as a revenue of 168. As I'd mentioned to you, we are in the process, and as you're well aware, of reorganizing our parks and work crew division, which used to be together under community justice. And currently, where the administration has chosen to, and the Board of Commissioners is supportive of moving parks under public works. But the work crew project will continue to remain in Fund 21. As a result of lacking, I hear in the heyday, and Ken, of course, used to work in that position, that we had as many as 30 workers that we could send out to support contracts, to support our parks. And quite frankly, over the years, we've just seen that continue to decline for a variety of reasons. Criminal justice reform, COVID was a huge hit for a while. I had 4 work crew supervisors who completed all the contracts and all the maintenance of the parks as the best they can. But quite frankly, as of yet, our crews have dwindled to 2 to 3 people per day. And so we've really had to make some tough decisions about how to utilize those folks. And so we are in the process of canceling the majority of our contracts to be able to focus on just the maintenance of our parks, quite frankly. The one contract that we did renegotiate was with Chehalem Park and Rec. And we did have to make the decision to shift from 60 hours of work with them to 40 hours each week. So I am requesting that we change that revenue line from 168,000 to 125,045.
Jessica, you said Chehalem Parks gets 40 hours a week on contract. How does that compare to county parks, the rest of county parks?
So the rest of the county parks continues to be supported by 2 other work crew supervisors. So the contract, I believe, says that we need to have at least a minimum of 2 crew with whoever's working those particular parks. But it really, having that contract really offsets the cost to the Department of Corrections grant and aid funding that we were having to use. And so quite frankly, it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. I anticipate we may decide that we need to make more changes as we facilitate this change between parks and work crew. My hope is that work crew will eventually increase. I mean, it's the only restorative justice program that we have here in Yamaha County, and it is a huge benefit to the adults in custody who are able to be released for the day and able to be outside, fresh air, learn job skills, and give back to the community. And it's a huge contribution to Yamaha County and to our parks, of course, certainly. So I hope that answered your question.
Just in terms of hours per week, is there a comparison there?
I'm trying to understand because the comparison, because in 1081, that budget, you're going to see that there's a full-time manager and then there's 2 staff who do the maintenance there. And then you have this one position that's in this budget that is doing the work crew elements. That would be performing the work on the contract under this budget. So you have 2 FTEs that are dedicated to parks. You have 1 FTE that's under this that would be doing the work. in the park system. If
Okay.
that makes sense.
Do we I can't remember, do we technically have a contract with, for county,
No,
just based on moving money around? Okay. So this is
no,
actually.
we don't have an internal contract for doing the work. No.
So this contract with Chehalem essentially provides the revenue for this work.
It does. Historically, this fund and the program, just going back, there were several contracts. There was contracts with Oregon State Parks, with school districts, Amity School District, Sheridan School District in the past, Chehalem Parks. So there were multiple agencies. So there's always been at least one position, sometimes more. As you can see, this used to have 2.5 positions
Yeah.
in this budget.
Mhm.
And a majority of the revenue, generated from those contract were paid, help offset the costs, not the full, but at least help to offset the cost of those crew supervisors and their equipment and everything and doing the work in those various contracts. But like Jessica was saying, most of those contracts have now been closed, but Chehalem Parks and Rec still wants to partner with corrections and still maintain the program. And so it's generating the revenue to help offset the cost of this position and program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Two other lines I wanted to point out in revenue under 38001. I believe that we need to add a footnote here. We typically have done so in the past for solid waste. And that's a continued service that we're able to provide. And then one other quick change to note, just because there is such a big change here in line 38060. This previously was an internal transfer from Public Works that supported a work crew supervisor. Unfortunately, again, based on our scenario with work crew, we're having to cut that position. Kevin Rose just retired as of last Friday, and so we don't have plans to fill that position currently. And hence you'll see the change in FTE when we get to personnel. So moving on to personnel. We do have a couple changes on line 40134. We're changing the division manager from a 0.2 to a 0.1. So the division manager for parks will be funded primarily in the Parks Fund 0.8. 0.1 here in this budget in order to provide oversight to the work crew program. And then I believe the other 0.1 FTE is in the Public Works butterfly budget. And then the only other change to mention here is 40325, changing the 2.5 to a 1.0 FTE. And again, that is because we are moving a 0.5 to parks. So we'll have 2 full FTE in parks and 1 full-time FTE for the work crew supervisors in this budget, and then cutting the one that I just mentioned with the retirement. And then I will make note, due to this large, pretty significant change in FTEs from 0.25 to 1.0, you will see a variety of line item changes due to those FTE changes in the roll-ups and such below. Moving on to materials and services. And again, you'll see because of the diminishing of the program, you'll see a variety of line items, central supplies, uniforms, those kind of things that will certainly be affected by the loss of the FTE. Any questions on 2163?
Yes. So you reduced your beginning balance to 125,045. Where is that balancing the expenses? Because you reduced that number, I need to know where we're balancing.
In the
it.
ending balance, yeah. So when we get on to page.
So that'll be reflected in the ending balance for the fund? Okay.
That's correct. Good question.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to page 66, which is the last fund in 2167, last but not least. And this is the Senate Bill 1145 funds from the Department of Corrections grant and aid that is utilized for transition planning of those adults in custody that serve their sentences locally. So you will see a bit of a change on 334.67 in revenue. And again, that just designates that we made our best guess and we actually know what our budget is this time. So there is a bit of a change. Moving down into personnel, no changes there. These are the other pieces of the FTE that you saw in 2145. And in materials and services, no changes to point out to the committee unless there are questions. All right, and then moving on to page 68, our ending balance. So this is where we're going to make that change. So currently in 99001, we have listed 437,885 as our ending balance. We would like to change that to 394,930. And again, that's due to those changes with CPRD contract. Any questions on Fund 21 or the adult division before we move on to juvenile? Okay, so moving on to page 69. We'll start with our juvenile probation department budget, which is 1074. So you see there our beginning balance in revenue. I do need to make a bit of a change with regard to 33411. You'll see there we received a Youth Development Council grant, transition grant in the amount of 103,920. And despite our greatest attempts, we've had a great deal of difficulty in being able to recruit for this position. What the grant was intended for was our transition education specialist. And we were able to support this position for the last 2 biennium through grant funding, and we received that grant funding again. But unfortunately, the individual that was working in that position decided to pursue other pursuits. And so we ended up having a vacant position and we just have not been able to fill that. At one point, there was even the intent to raise it from a 0.8 FTE to a full-time, hoping that that would improve our recruitment. And unfortunately, it just hasn't. So we have agreed to go ahead and terminate that contract. The good news is that due to a legislative change, the Multnomah County Education Service that we contract through our detention facility will have funding to support that person, but somebody they've already had hired. And so they will go ahead and be able to provide those services to us as of July 1. So we lucked out in that sense. So you will see a variety of changes as we go through. My best recommendation for the budget committee is I actually have created this fun line item handout as opposed to going through all of those changes with the budget committee. Unless that's what you'd like me to do, my proposal would be just to, with your approval, give those to finance and administration and they can make those changes.
Yeah, so to clarify, you're removing 103,920 from that revenue line, and then you're going to be cutting the expenses based on the chart that you have.
That's correct.
Okay.
There is one other change, if I could, actually 2 other changes to revenue. In that same line that we were talking about with 33411, you will also see $28,099. That was a criminal justice grant that was provided to us from the Commission for Specialty Courts, our juvenile specialty courts. So that was just recently awarded, and it covers 0.2, the cost of 0.2 of our FTE for the PO that is assigned to that court.
Chair, I have a question. Jessica, I have a question. The OIA expunctions, can you explain that footnote?
Let's see.
And that's, we're at,
For 10,000.
Right.
4334.11.
Yes, so, and I'm going to look back at Dana Corelli, who actually sat on that committee as the legislation was passing. But essentially, it required any youth that had involvement with our department, not adjudicated, which in the adult world is convicted, but somebody that we had worked with through our family informal means, that those cases were required to be expunged as soon as they turned the age of 18. Luckily, there was some funding, and I believe that went to the Board of Commissioners, the contract with the state to provide that funding. It actually is much more significant than the 10,000 listed here, because we just don't anticipate having that workload for the total amount that was proposed to be given to us by the Oregon Youth Authority. Did
Thank
that answer your question,
Thank
Commissioner?
you. Thank you, Dana.
And then one last line in revenue, 34115, discovery fees. This was another legislative change that essentially prevented our department from charging discovery fees for any of our youth that are indigent. And quite frankly, all of our youth are indigent. So you see that zeroed out there. And then moving into personnel. The one change to point out is the line 40224, the education transition specialist, which was listed as a 0.8. You see the 1.0 here, but we're actually needing to zero that out due to the grant. And one other thing to point out to the committee, 40330 and 40331 under Juvenile Probation Officer 1 and 2. It appears that there's a requested change in FTE, but those actually already went to the board in the 2021-22 fiscal year and were approved. And typically, when we hire a brand new PO, they start as a PO1 and work with youth that are less risk. And once they're with us for approximately 2 to 3 years, we go ahead and graduate them to a juvenile PO2, in which they work with higher risk youth. Any questions on personnel? Moving down into materials and services. And again, this is where, there will be some pretty significant, not significant changes, but a lot of changes based on the loss of the grant and the loss of the FTA, the Education Transition Specialist. Any questions on materials and services?
There we go. The contract services, just is that number increasing because of working with Multnomah ESD?
Actually,
Or is it staying at 35,000?
it is staying at 35,000. Yeah, so we have a MOU. Oh, it is. Vicky's correcting me. Thank you.
Okay, I figured that it was in there and I should have just been like, hey, can I see that? But okay, thanks, Vicky and Director.
Thanks, Vicky. Any other questions? Okay, moving right along. Last budget here on page 71 is our juvenile detention facility, Fund 1077. There you see our beginning balance. We do have a bit of a change in 33411. In that, this fund in previous years, OYA funds went into our juvenile probation, and then we transferred to support 0.5 of an FTE that did community service work for our juvenile youth. And we felt that since the FTE was actually in this budget, that it made more sense to have the revenue come directly to this budget. And I will also point out to you 34202, credit to my juvenile detention management team. They did a lot of work, and we actually, for the first time in years, increased our as needed bed from 158 to 168. And so you do see quite a nice increase there. Moving on to personnel. The only change that I have to point out to you is in 47900 other earnings. This was an effort to be able to provide 5% lead correction specialist pay for our detention workers when we don't have a manager that's actually working in the facility. So we only have one manager and two supervisors, and despite, you know, our best attempts, you just can't have three people cover 24/7. So this ensures that there's some additional responsibility and process in place to notify managers and as needed of any particular incidents. Moving down into materials and services. Nothing to point out unless there's questions. And then moving into our ending balance 99001, we do have quite a healthy ending balance, which is not normal for this budget, quite frankly. In years past, this budget has been so difficult to fund. As you can imagine, the majority of it is personnel. We've actually had to take funding from juvenile probation and put into this budget. This ending balance will allow us to continue to support detention, but at some point we may need to transfer funds back to juvenile probation.
And Director, along those lines, I mean, obviously the room and board is contracts are a big portion. I mean, they're a portion of it. Forgive me for not remembering. Is there a base? Like, hey, this is how much you county are gonna pay, or is it strictly up per day?
It's, well, actually we have,
If the contract came for us, I just don't remember.
oh yeah, absolutely. We have two contracts that have a specific allotment of beds that they always pay for. So
Okay.
Polk County, for instance, has 4 beds. So they're always paying for 4 beds. Clatsop County has 1.5 beds, for instance. Our as needed contracts, which we also have through Crook County, Tillamook County, and I'm forgetting the others. Go ahead. Columbia. Those are just per day.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Commissioner. And with that, that concludes my presentation unless there are additional questions.
I just want to say thank you, Director. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Scott. The work that you do over there, it's impactful for those kids. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just to throw Vicki under the bus one more time, she retired officially on Friday after 33.5 years of service to Yamaha County and DCJ specifically. But I dragged her back in on contract just for this special occasion. So thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Vicki.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, I think we're going to take a 5-minute break prior to shift sunset.
Yeah, I know.
We're back on. All right, welcome back. Welcome, Sheriff Svensson.
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't want to get too close to the mic.
Get as close as you can so we can hear you.
All right, well, good morning still. It's good to see you guys all in person. Obviously, I'm Sheriff Tim Swenson. I'm here to talk about 8 budgets within our office, so it's going to be kind of a marathon. So I will try to stop when you guys look like you're questioning something and I think you might have a question. I'll make sure I pause to allow you guys to continue. Just a couple general remarks. Obviously, this day and age, criminal justice has continued to be kind of in the spotlight across the state. A lot of legislative changes have come down over the years. Even more so in this last short session, we saw almost 16 bills come through that had some very specific impacts on how law enforcement does their job. A lot of the impacts were things that we were already working towards, things that law enforcement leaders across the state, to include myself, were at the table helping draft to be basically what I would consider the lesser of two evil. The way that the legislature is set up right now, they had the ability to make things really, really bad for us. And so to be able to have the ability to sit at the table and try to see what we can do to manage and mitigate as much as the impact as possible. So where we're at today isn't the best seat that we want to be at, but at least we have the ability to continue to have that conversation. The neighbors to the north are not so lucky. Washington, they just had a lot of sweeping changes that pushed through that they didn't have any say over, and you're starting to see those impacts. So that being said, a little bit it will impact how we do business. Senate Bill 48 with the pretrial, for example, we had mentioned, Jessica Beach had talked about, I don't see it impacting the way we do business so much in Yamhill County, and the fact that we've already been doing pretrial work for so long. Jessica's office with the pretrial release officers and the work that we've done across the county for the last probably 10 or 12 years has kind of put us in a position so that when stuff like this does come forward, we're better able to respond. It will have a little bit of impact on how the judges get to direct our staff on when we release people, when we don't. But at the same time, we won't see a huge impact in a change with the way my staff does business, because we've been doing something very similar for quite some time. But that being said, as we go through our budgets, you're going to see that a lot of our budgets, for the most part, are seeing some increases, obviously, in the personnel line, which is you're going to hear from every department within the county. The other big piece to point out is that the majority of my budgets will have a budgeted ending balance of less than $50,000, which, if you're going through and looking at my funds and you see how large these are and how much money we're needing to have at the end of the year in order for us to be able to break even going into the next fiscal year, you're going to see that we're probably headed towards some challenging times on having to make decisions on where we put our money and how we invest in criminal justice. So just moving forward, just note that a lot of these balances do come out at the end. We typically have a lot of savings throughout the year with vacancies. We currently have a couple positions in our jail that are open that we're anticipating filling soon. Got a few positions on the patrol side that have been given conditional offers. But every time we have these openings, as we move that process through, anytime that position sits open, it's just savings that we have towards the end of the year. We've had a few administrative positions. I had a program manager in the jail. She just recently retired. That particular position is going to be absorbed internally. We're moving some of those responsibilities to other portions of the office within the jail, which then frees up the funding for that position to be spread out within the personnel in the jail. And then on the patrol side, I have a captain who's going to be retiring at the end of this year, or at the end of this month. That position obviously will create a little bit of a vacancy for a few months until we determine how that structure is going to look like. And if we end up filling that, every time we fill in a vacancy of that nature at that high level of administration, it typically has a trickle down effect. But we also have another employee who's retiring at the end of this month as well, a deputy. which will provide some additional savings because he's a top step, and the hope is to bring in some lower step. And then we're anticipating, just like the entire state of Oregon, over the next year or so, we anticipate at least 5 different retirements within our office as people continue to move through their careers. So that being said, in general terms, we'll go ahead and start with the jail budget, which is going to start on page 73. A big piece to point out is our beginning balance, budgeted beginning balance. The jail has had a significant amount of revenue that was put it into that fund during last COVID fiscal year. I refer to it as the COVID fiscal year of 2021. And then we also had some additional funds and revenue coming in 21, 22, all specific to COVID related areas where we were able to identify that a certain percentage of our job had changed specifically to the mitigation of COVID within the facility. And Ken was able to identify some dollars that came in through the state that we could input into that, which is going to reflect in that high ending balance. So that's not a typical beginning balance moving forward, primarily because of that additional revenue, but it does help us tremendously moving forward in this fiscal year. The other piece that you're going to notice that we have removed from the budget, which is something that we typically have had, is that MAT program. We were going to talk with HHS about partnering with them to continue to provide MAT. Public health obviously had a little bit more on their plate the last year than we did when it came to MAT. So we're still in conversations, but we haven't come to an agreement on what that might look like moving forward. But our MAT funding, which was in our budget for the last few years, is basically out of it just because we don't have a plan moving forward. The hope is, as we start bringing our population back in and we start having more of a need, we've began working with the state of Oregon again as a filing for their 1115 Medicaid waiver. That filing process for the additional 5 years is open for public comment right now. I was able to submit support through the Oregon State Sheriff's Association for the state of Oregon's waiver, because again, they've added in there the ability to use Medicaid and Medicare dollars on people who are incarcerated pre-trial. So our hope is that the Oregon's Medicaid, Medicare 1115 waiver for the next 5 years will allow for us to use that funding. If that does happen, that's going to be a game changer for jails across the state, including ours, where you could see a very large portion of our medical expenses through WellPath, an MAT program, and a few others. Pretty much every eligible expense under the Oregon Health Plan for individuals who are in our facility can be billed back to Medicare and Medicaid the entire time they're in our custody. And so that would be a huge revenue change for us, where we could then move our medical expenses to other parts within our budget. So hopefully that will come to fruition, but we'll see. And pretty much the only major changes you're going to see in 1041, other than the increase in personnel, is going to be on page 74 with our materials and services. As we continue to move through, we are starting to better reflect exactly how our expenses are. With the addition of the accounting position in my office, she's been able to really dial in exactly where our expenses are, code things appropriately. So some of the changes you're going to see with some increases in our materials and services specifically reflect what our true costs have been trending for the last 3 or 4 years. Our food line, 51126, you're going to see that go up a little bit more. That's primarily in anticipation with having an increased population. Obviously, if you have more individuals in custody, you're going to be spending more on food. And other than that, there's really not much change in the materials and services. Any questions about the jail budget? And a tiny ending balance. Yeah. The interesting part about the jail, as you're going to see, is regardless of the population in that facility, it still costs the same amount of money to run. So we are currently today, our population's 96. We will start seeing that number gradually start to increase. We just changed our protocols with the CDC allowing us to double bunk now. So now we can increase our population. Quarantine time for new AICs is 5 days as opposed to the 14 days. So we're starting to be able to process people through. And as the DA had indicated, as trials start to pick back up and they start working through the facility and the system, I had a meeting yesterday with the judge who were talking about pretrial, and she said it's really nice to be able to know that now she doesn't have to make a determination of what she's going to do with the case moving forward on whether or not there's a bed that's open in the facility. And so I think the judges are going to get back to the old ways of when people are coming in, they're going to process them and they'll start seeing more people coming into our facility. So. Okay, on to the Marine budget, 1042, the fun one, page 75. Hot off the press for those who haven't seen the new flyer. You know that you're on the map in the state of Oregon when the Marine Board makes a postcard specifically for the Newburgh pool and the new towed water sports regulations. For those who are not aware, the state through the short session rammed a new legislative concept and bill through that further restricts the ability to do anything on the Willamette from the mouth of the Yamhill River all the way down to the falls. And basically it requires you're not allowed to tow anybody behind your boat, whether they're on an inner tube, on a wakeboard or anything, unless your boat is less than 5,500 pounds dry. So I don't know how many people know how to weigh a boat when they're in the water, but we're supposed to weigh the boat when it's in the water to determine if it's under 5,500 pounds. And if it is under that weight, then you have to take another class from the state to teach you how to tow people behind you, and then you get a sticker. So if you have the sticker, then that tells us that you're under the 5,500 pounds and you've taken the class and you can successfully tow someone from behind the boat. If you weigh more than 5,500, you don't get a sticker and you can't tow anybody behind your boat. But you can drive up and down the river all day, all you want, and push out a 7-foot wake. But you can't tow anybody behind it. So that means changes on Marine program moving forward. I mean, we were really set for having a need to have additional staff on there for enforcement purposes and for the fact that people are out there recreating. Well, now it's for the complete opposite. Now we're going to be put into a position where we're going to have to start educating and enforcing this new regulation that is in essence going to not make very many people happy. And a lot of people are not going to be aware that this law has been pushed through and is now the current restriction on that stretch of river. So we continue to get 60-some thousand, 63,000 from the Marine Board to continue to operate out there. Last year, we did go back to the Marine Board and ask for some additional funds. They had identified funding through a special emphasis, which we were able to acquire. And they also identified roughly 30,000 that they were planning on giving to us in addition to the 63 to assist them with placing of the buoys, which was going to educate the public on the previous restrictions that the river had. But with this new law, it basically makes all of that null and void. And so the Marine Board has basically reallocated that 30,000 someplace else because they don't have a need anymore for us to be placing all those buoys. And so we lost pretty much that additional revenue with this as well. So moving forward this budget year, there is some changes that we're looking at making just based off of some anticipated carryover that was not accounted for in this time when we put the budget together in February. Those changes are roughly around $14,000 of additional carryover that we're just going to add straight to a personnel line. And I have those changes, Ken, that we can ship to Mike to make, but basically it's just increasing time on the water by roughly $14,000 for personnel. But other than that, no other major changes with the Marine budget.
So to clarify, it's 14,000 being added to the beginning balance,
Uh,
or is it being added to the 331.15?
Yeah, so it'll go into the 40403 and the 40402. So it's basically all, and then it'll
Oh.
come off the ending balance. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you're not adding to the beginning balance, you're reducing the ending balance and adding it to the personnel lines.
Correct.
Okay, I'm glad I asked. Okay.
Yeah, and we've got that little cool spreadsheet here that we can send in a memo to Mike.
So am I reading this right? Is that there's a halftime position to be on
Yeah.
the river to help enforce this new?
In essence, and that halftime is in essence primarily reserves and part-time seasonal staff that we have out there. Last year at this time, we were talking about the possibility of trying to find a way to fund a full-time Marine deputy out there.
Yeah.
Given some other conversations that we're going to have as we continue through our budgets, that kind of changed. But it still doesn't change the fact that regardless, the amount of staff that we have out on that river is not adequate to cover what we're doing. We met with the Marine Board director, I did a couple weeks ago at a conference I was at, and he understands our issues. He is of a different type of philosophy, where the previous Marine Board director was very set on that 3-year study that they would do. This director is just understanding that it doesn't matter what the study shows. He knows that the Newburgh pool is the most highly populated stretch of the Willamette, and is probably sees close to the same amount of traffic, and is second to Hood River County for the windsurfing. And so he knows that there's a huge need. And there are a ton of programs throughout the state that traditionally just don't spend their money, and they'll waste it on other things. And so he's advocating heavily to start reassigning funds that are either not allocated or are just not being used appropriately, and then trying to find ways to redirect that to the areas that need it. So I would say that's probably going to take a year or two for him to truly readdress that funding formula, but I could see our base amount coming from the state starting to increase, but it's going to take a few years.
Are they planning on doing any signage or anything?
I think so. They've got postcards.
But I mean, at the, where you put quotes at.
I have a feeling that they will start putting, working with our parks to set up a sign. There was a press release that they sent out back in April and talking about it, but majority of the public are not going to be aware. The ones who it's going to affect the most are well aware. We've had several phone calls from a lot of individuals who invest a lot of money into this recreation, and we're talking $120,000 boats, and they go out there to have a good time on the Willamette, and they are not the people that we're concerned about because they follow the rules, but because of this new regulation, they won't be able to do any of that.
I have so many questions, but they're not budget related.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Hello, Sheriff Svensson. My name is
Anything else on
Doreen
marine
App.
budget.
Hello.
Doreen, did you have a question?
I do, thank you. So sorry. Sheriff Svensson, I am the disembodied budget committee member known as Doreen App. I'm coming in via Zoom, and I just have a quick question on the budget. There's an entry for $12,225 on a marine safety officer, but there's no FTE allocated to that. Is that $12,225 a portion of the $14,000 you were discussing earlier?
No, that $12,225 is for our part-time seasonal marine safety officers, which are traditionally cadets, people who are over the age 18 but can't carry a gun. So we don't have an actual FTE attached to it because it's all seasonal contract work. So we'll hire, sometimes we hire 2 people, sometimes we hire 6. And then we just spread that out and just manage the money. And when the money's out, then they don't get scheduled.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. On to patrol. The big one. So the first thing I would point out is that if you are looking at this patrol budget, which is going to be starting on page, let me get through all the other stuff, 76. Page 76. This particular budget, after we were able to do some creative maneuver of some other additional funds from other funds, we were able to put this budget together with only the restriction of one deputy. The previous budget that I was going to have to enter would have restricted and reduced this fund by 3 staff. And so as of right now, this budget only has one position that's been cut out of this program. But as we discussed the add back here later, you're going to see that the add back request does cover that one position that was eliminated. All the city contracts, as you know, we have 10 positions that are paid for by the cities. All those contracts have been sent through. Most of those are going to be right at the same level, current level. The city of Dayton is the only one that is kind of up in question. They have a levy that's currently on the ballot that will come up in next couple weeks. And that would continue to fund their current level. The last one that they put on was going to be an increase in some services and a few other things. And that one was defeated, I think, by 7 votes in the city. And so now they've gone back to, no, we just want status quo, which is basically one deputy position. So not knowing exactly what happens with that, this budget is built assuming that it's status quo and the funding comes through. But if that funding or that levy does not pass in a couple weeks, then we'll have to make a decision of whether or not we try to find a way to absorb it, which obviously as it is right now, we would not be able to absorb it because we've already had to cut one position. And the other option is just to eliminate an additional position from the patrol division. We also will be adding a placeholder, which we haven't quite done yet, but Ken and I were talking. We have this opportunity again to apply for a grant through the Criminal Justice Commission for a marijuana eradication. They actually call it the Illegal Marijuana Market Enforcement Grant Program. We applied with a grant through Polk County as a partner. Polk County was actually the one who applied for it in the first round, and they received roughly 680 some thousand to share between the two. And so we've got a detective right now that is being funding from partly from a grant through Polk County that's assisting on these grow operations. What we have found is that we have a large number of them in Yamhill County that are just operating right underneath everyone's nose. And we, of course, are aware of it, but the general public are not. And they are large organizations that are through some sort of crime syndicate, I would say, that they pay cash for the property and they pay everybody their cash. And it's a huge black market for the marijuana portion. State of Oregon identified that there is a huge increase in issues, and it wasn't just happening down in the Southern Oregon, in the south part of the state, that it's now starting to happen here more in the Willamette Valley and up in the Columbia County region. And so they identified the need, and they identified an additional 20 million that they're going to put through. So we have the opportunity to apply for a grant. It's due May 11th. So I don't know the exact numbers yet, but the thought process that Ken and I talked about is what we've done in the past is as we go through that process and try to apply for it, get the approval, we'll put just a placeholder in a forfeiture or a revenue line with a placeholder and expense. But the idea would be that this grant would be for specifically possibly 2 detectives and a supervisor or part-time supervisor. And that would basically be dedicated for this team. And it would be grant funded through 2025. The big piece, which has always been my issue, is I don't like adding positions in my budget that are grant funded. This grant allows me to just reassign existing staff and use that money. So I won't have to be hiring new staff to fill those positions. I could just assign internal staff and go from there. So, yeah.
The existing deputy that is doing this work through the grant, was that an additional hire?
No, we chose not to do an additional hire on that one. We took our CRT, our community response detective, and just assigned him to that temporarily. So
So the new funds would be that person plus maybe two more.
correct.
Your microphone.
Sorry.
Yes, Commissioner.
Sure, a couple of questions.
Also, don't forget your microphone.
I think it's on. A couple of questions. Thank you for the information, Emily. Thank you for backup. Reinforcements here. A couple of things regarding that. Can you give us a little more detail, not specific details, but sort of fill out the scope of how that is impacting not only your staff, but public safety and the scope of those illegal grows in the county?
Yeah, so you have a wide range of issues. You have just the local public safety issue, livability issues. We've had a lot of fires. They're not using certified electricians to set up these grow sites. And to set it up the right way, you're running a large amount of electricity through large amounts of nurseries, and it's unsafe to say. And so we've had issues with fires and other complications with that. Then you add in the criminal element of the people who now have identified that this is where it's at. They wait for them to process the grow. And then we have people that like to try to break into these places to steal the product. And then in addition to that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's human trafficking, but it's got a nexus to the human traffic piece where you have individuals that are literally being brought to this community for one reason only, and that is to live on site in not very good conditions and getting paid cash to operate these places. And these homes are being used and these properties are being used for nothing more than just that. And so we'll go to a site that will have a house with 3 or 4 individuals living there. And they literally are there only for that reason. They don't know who the person is. Someone randomly shows up, drops off more supplies, hands them cash, and then picks up the product and takes it off to another location. And it's very well organized within that piece, but the people that are living there, they have nothing to do other than just literally grow it and process it. And so these individuals are being brought here from other parts of the state, other parts of the United States, sometimes from other countries, specifically to operate these grows. And so we're just now starting to scrape the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these, because we're now starting to identify what these properties look like, what their network looks like, where they're facilitated. When we hit one house, we learn that there's 6 or 7 other properties that are in the area that we need to go look at. And a lot of times these individuals go from one house and now they're connected to 8 or 9 in other counties. And so those are things that we have to look out for. Oh, and one of my captains who's paying attention online who wanted to remind us that these individuals are drug trafficking organizations. They don't pay taxes on this. And so that's another, there's another piece to it. So you have the legal marijuana growing community that does it the right way, that has the processing, has the tracking, that has the taxes. And then you have the black market who is able to undermine that legal process and not have to pay any taxes into the community.
Is there a component here of any kind of asset forfeiture that you have the ability to do?
Yes, and with the way that the laws are now, the pendulum's kind of swung the other way. It's a little easier on these properties. We've had a handful of them where literally we can show very clearly that it was paid for by cash. And so the entire property can be forfeited and seized. We have large amounts of cash seizures that are coming through these programs. So I would see that we get a lot of forfeiture that would come in. And you'll see as we go through into our next, in our 1069 fund, that we do have some funds that we're allocating that we anticipate to see as forfeiture. But again, with forfeiture, that helps us in some areas because we can spend it on certain things, equipment, training. We can't always spend it on staff, but it will definitely help us in the long run as we start bringing in some of those revenues, and we can use them for other ways.
And I have one more question that has to do with the increase in CHLs and the increase in CHL fees and how that impacts your budget. And if you could, because I'm looking at it here and I'm not seeing something clear. Maybe you can tell me where I need to look for that.
Yeah, so if you're looking specifically for CHL, so the 322.91
Got it?
is the weapons permits. That is a portion of the fee that comes in. The other piece is the state police weapons. 322.92. That's basically the fingerprint fee revenue line. That's basically an in and out. The money that comes in goes directly to the state for the process of the fingerprint. So what you would be looking at, for example, is in our existing fiscal year 21-22, we budgeted roughly 100,000 for revenue and CHLs. The year to date, which is from about 4 weeks ago, when they ran this report, showed us at 66,987. So we put into our proposed budget for this fiscal year 22-23 as 110,000 with the anticipation of renewals and increases. Part of that additional fee, we have put together a program that we're going to be utilizing to train individuals on that CHL piece. We've talked with the commissioners, I think, before about that concept. We're going to be rolling that out here shortly, but in essence, some of the additional revenue that's coming in because of that increase in fee that isn't necessarily going to the actual processing of the CHL is going to be redirected to our staff that are going to be putting on that training. And so there's really no way to accurately show that direct connection within the budget other than you're going to see that there's additional revenue coming in those lines than we traditionally have had. And then those are just going to go back to offset some of those personnel expenses.
Okay, but you don't have an estimate of what, I know Commissioner Bershauer was working with you on that training class. I appreciate that, Commissioner. But there's no estimate, no cost of what that would look like?
We're too new into that new fee. We don't have enough time my guess is this time next year, we'll have a better understanding of what that impact looked like with that additional fee. Because we've been charging that fee for roughly 7 or 8 months now. And it's hard to tell based off of new CHLs, renewals, and what that additional revenue looks like. But I can tell you that the class that we're putting together is roughly 2 hours long. And it's a sergeant within our office that's going to be putting on that class. We'll be able to better know where we're at in a year from now of what that's actually looking like.
Okay, and thank you for doing that.
Chair, is there a cost associated with that class that you've logged?
No. What we're going to do is we're going to see how many people show up, track how long he's there, and then we'll know exactly how much of that time of his time was spent on that. So we'll have a true dollar amount.
Okay. And just to follow up on the illegal grow operations, and this might be a dumb question, but I'm assuming that you weren't aggressively going after those before you had the funds to do so. So there's a expansion of your capacity of what you're doing. I'm envisioning that it's quite dangerous, right? These folks have nothing to lose. Is there an added concern over security of your deputies? Is there, something that you need to shift in terms of helping protect them? And the people that you find, I'm making an assumption, but they're going to go into social services. Is that correct? Because they have nothing.
Yes, it's a complicated process once they actually get brought into the system. Some of these individuals, will be prosecuted through whatever means the DA's office has. Depending on their citizenship, that will determine where they go from there. The initial part, as far as the investigation, I would agree that we knew that there was always an issue out there. It just never was something that we could attack because we just, one, didn't have the bodies or the time to dedicate to that. And then two, some of the laws have really made it harder for us to actively go after people who are growing marijuana. You even see today when we put out these press releases, the first thing that people are commenting is, why are you guys picking on people for growing weed? It's legal. Well, these aren't the mom and pops who are growing weed in their backyard. These are people that are growing thousands of plants that have hundreds of pounds of dried product that have the butane oil that they're running through that is highly dangerous to produce, and they're shipping these off as a black market to other parts of the state. So that's the type of element that we're trying to go after. And so a grant like this would give us the opportunity to dedicate the time to that. And then as far as the equipment and the training and stuff, there's always a need to better equip our staff in this day and age. You'll actually see one of the requests that I have in here specifically goes to that, because for the last 5 years, we've done a pretty good job of just keeping our materials and services flat and redirecting those to pay for obviously our increase in personnel expenses. But we're at a point now where there's some very important equipment that my staff need to have in order to be able to do their job safely. That would assist in these type of investigations, plus additional investigations that we're dealing with. And so as we move forward, the grant will allow us to spend some money on some of that stuff, but because it's so limited on the 20 million, I want to try to focus as much as I can on that grant for the actual personnel to be able to get those bodies out there doing the job.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the major changes you're going to see in our budget, which will show up as a revenue line on page 76, and is also going to show up as an expense on page 77, has to do with our share of sales, 342, 37, and then 695, 37. That's the in and out for foreclosure sales. As we're coming to an end of COVID, the restriction and the moratorium on the foreclosure process has been lifted. So we're starting to see those foreclosures start to come through. We're still not sure exactly what's going to look like from the bank's perspective, because they have options to go through a trustee sale as opposed to a foreclosure process. Trustee sale does not require them to go through the courts, which obviously are bogged down with all the criminal cases. So if they choose to continue to go the standard old-fashioned foreclosure rate, we have adjusted that budget to increase it to 5 million. And again, for those who don't recall, that's literally just an in and out. So when we get a foreclosure from the court and we go out on the steps of the courthouse and sell the property to a private party, whatever the price of that property that's sold for, that money comes into our office. We have to accept that as a revenue and turn right around and cut a check back to the bank. And so it's an in and out. But if we don't have the appropriation authority in here and we run over that, it becomes a problem when it comes to us having to process a sale for $700,000 when we don't have the appropriation authority. So we put that in there as a buffer. It kind of makes our revenues look kind of off and our expenses look off, but it's truly just an in and out for that purpose.
Chair, I have a question.
Yes.
Or Sheriff. So I can't remember, do you recall what the other expense was that was budgeted 250,000?
Yes, so that was
Because typically you don't have anything there.
correct. Yeah, so that was the federal foreclosure on a piece of property that was outside of
That's right.
Carlton, Yamhill,
Mhm.
on a federal case that we did. We've received word that we were possibly going to get close to 250,000 in the revenue from that sale of that property, which was roughly $600,000 or $700,000. The problem that we received the information probably about 6 months ago, give or take, is that the federal government was going to hold that dollar amount and they were going to divvy up the proceeds of the sale of the property to all the victims first, and then distribute forfeiture. And so as soon as we received that notice, I just took the line out because we're not going to get that money, because rightfully so, that money should go to the victims. And so they are going to be distributing that to the victims. So any money that we were anticipating, which was that 250,000, we just took out of the budget this year. As you'll see in every budget, we had it there as an in and out, but we never spent it. because we didn't have it. But now that we know that's not going to come through, then we just went ahead and removed it.
Okay, thanks.
If I might. Really quick on the Dayton deputy,
Yes.
is it pretty much a clean 1-for-1 type contract where if it doesn't pass, it's literally one deputy that comes off?
Yeah, so I mean, they're contracted positions, so I don't count the 10 contract deputies as part of our rural patrol team. So in essence, if we lose a contract position, historically, we try to absorb that into our staff so we don't lose a body.
Mhm.
We traditionally, just because we don't have the contract, doesn't mean we're not going to respond to some calls.
Mhm.
But that being said, we are in a position with some retirements anticipated moving forward. And some of the positions that we know that we may have opening up, we're not going to move forward with a hiring process until we find out specifically what happens. Because if we had to reduce that by one, it would be in essence a retirement position I just wouldn't fill. Our contract positions would go from 10 to 9. My rural patrol team would stay the same. And then it would be a loss of a body to the city of Dayton.
Okay, so there's no overlap with other communities? I mean,
Correct.
That person is.
Yeah,
Dayton.
that one's
Okay.
designated to Dayton. We don't have any crossover contracts. We used to in Sheridan and Willamina because how close they were. But we haven't had those for years. But yeah, so it would just be a straight position in Dayton.
Okay.
Chair. Sheriff, a question about that. In terms of, I remember at one point we were having discussions how difficult it was for recruitment. And we know that the object of the game was to get a lateral. Just wondering what it is, if you might, even if you don't need anybody specifically right now, what the climate is in terms of what you're seeing, how much easier that would be or not for recruitment here.
Yeah, so we went through a market adjustment for our office over the last 3 years, which has tremendously improved our ability to recruit good quality lateral candidates. We've hired a lot of good candidates out of the metro area. We've had a few from Washington County, one that worked in Clackamas County, a few from the Sherwood area. And we have a couple individuals who are looking to come to our office that have already been conditional offers that are already funded in this budget that aren't subject to an elimination. One's from Tigard, one's from Polk County. Where we're at right now in law enforcement as a whole is we're starting to see a lot of need of positions, and the pool is really small. And so anytime you have a process you open up, you're either going to have a handful of really good lateral candidates that have applications in multiple counties, and it's a matter of who can snag them first. And so all of the agencies in the state are competing for the same group of people. And then our new pool, our what I would call green individuals who have no experience whatsoever, are not currently working in law enforcement, is not anywhere near the quality and the size that we would need it to. So when we're actively recruiting and trying to hire people, that market adjustment gave us the opportunity to compete with these other agencies to the point where now people are looking at from those other agencies to come here. So if we lose a position and we have, or an individual that retires, for example, as soon as we open it up, we try to get that position filled as quick as possible, because there's a point of me that says I want to be able to save some money on the back end and keep it open for a little while. But because the pool's so small, I've these two individuals that I have right now that I've already given conditionals to, that I'm waiting for a couple more steps to be completed. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that another agency doesn't get through their process quicker and then offer them a position because they're obviously looking to go someplace else. So it's a issue that I think we're going to have for another 3 or 4 years in law enforcement. The day of having a lot of good college candidates come out right out of college that want to go into law enforcement are gone. It's not a field that too many people want to get into anymore for multiple reasons. And so anytime we have that ability to get someone who has already been in and been proven, just want to relocate for whatever reason, we try to take advantage of that as quick as possible. So with the patrol budget, you have that memo, which is an add back request. That add back request would total 137,747, which is in essence one full-time position. One of the things that we had talked about as far as safety and security and equipment needs, you'll see that you also have two other memos. And obviously, I'm well aware of the fact that you guys have a small pool of money to be able to be pulling from, but I put in these requests for a couple reasons. One is a request for, basically it's a 5-year plan on the purchase of body cameras. And it's a twofold purchase. It's a replacement of our existing tasers. Our tasers are a less lethal option that we've been using for years. They're antiquated. They're no longer supported by the company. So it's time for us to get new tasers. But this proposal that you see in front of you has been a year and a half, almost 2 years in the making of a conversation with the company about implementing a body camera program in Yamhill County. State of Oregon continues to have the conversation about mandating body cameras across the state. As always, they typically like to mandate things, but never find a way to fund it. The State Sheriff's Association a year ago pushed back. In the year that I was serving as the president for OSSA, we had a lot of conversations statewide and at the state level at the governor's office about, if you're going to mandate this statewide, we need to come up with a best practice for across the state of a possible solution for funding. They went to the state police to see what it would cost to run an operation statewide for a contract, realized that it was extremely expensive. And so they put the brakes on that and they said, well, let's try to see what we can do to allow for local control to see if they can start implementing their own programs. So we haven't had a mandate passed down yet. I totally expect to see something come through in the long session in 23, where they're going to continue to talk about body cameras. But that being said, it's a program that we've been looking at for a while. And so the proposal that you see in front of you is basically a 5-year contract. Most of the companies now have understood that we need to get ourselves put in a position where we know what it's going to cost us for a long period of time. This program would provide a body camera and a taser for every staff member in my office, whether they work on patrol or in the jail. It also provides for the software for the storage of all the footage. Provides for access to the software that allows us to go in and redact the video whenever we have a records request. Anytime a body camera footage is recorded and an individual requests a release of that video for any reason, we have to go through and actually redact all the faces of the individuals that were just in the peripheral that weren't part of the incident. And so before, it required a person sitting at the machine and physically redacting as it went through, and it was very time consuming. Now they have software that allows for you to select facial recognition in the software of the individuals that you want to keep in, and you select those faces, and then it goes through and automatically redacts all the other faces. And then we can have staff just go back, review it real quick to make sure it's good to go and move forward. So that request sits there in front of you as well, which it is a large dollar amount over a 5-year period, but it's roughly $115,000 a year for us to operate that between the patrol and the jail division. And then the only other request that you'll see in there is more along the lines of what Commissioner Bershauer is getting towards. It's a long list of additional equipment that our staff have been requesting us to try to find ways to fund. It's everything from a new program for stop sticks, which is a stick that you literally throw out in front of the car to deploy if there's a pursuit that deflates the tires. The old technology of a spike strip required the person to stand on the side of the road with a rope and try to pull it out in front of the car. These are Velcroed that you can just throw. It's like a little triangle stick that's got plastic around it, and you literally can just throw it out in front of the car. Safer to deploy, less injuries to the deputy when it's been deployed after it's done, because they have to pull it back and try to find a way to collapse that strip back. Those spikes are very sharp. They actually come issued with leather gloves. And so the stop sticks are a much safer program. But that's just an example of some of the things that we're looking at trying to purchase. We've got some shields that we're looking at getting. It's a typical unfortunate issued equipment now across the state. They're portable, they're ballistic proof. They allow for a deputy who's on their own out at a crime scene, waiting for someone to show up to back them up, gives them a little bit of additional security. And then a lot of the work that we're doing, we're not able to use the SWAT teams like they have up in the metro area, and we don't have an OSP SWAT team on call that can be out there within 20 minutes to assist. So a lot of the calls that our staff are going to are extremely dangerous. They're starting to get even more involved with additional weapons and stuff. And these shields provide us just additional protection for the individual that is showing up on scene. So you'll see a memo that basically asks for just a one-time allocation of $100,000 into our department equipment line that allows us to purchase a handful of these type of equipment that we've been looking for years that we just never had the ability to fund.
Shane, what's like kind of the shelf life for a taser? Like how long have you guys had your taser?
I think ours are 5 years.
Okay.
So
So pretty typical.
yeah, and under this program, which is what we're starting to see a lot of our equipment, we're looking at doing the same thing with our MDTs. It's basically a lease program. You're purchasing, you're paying a monthly fee or a yearly fee. They provide you the taser, all the equipment that goes with it, and then they replace it when the new technology comes out. And then every 5 years you get new equipment. So that's kind of the old way of doing it, is you bought it and you held on to it, and then you'd have to pay to maintain it and replace them as needed. The new way of doing things is you just pay a monthly fee. It actually saves us money over the long run, and we pay yearly and we just hand it back to them. It's very similar to your cell phone. When you, after 2 years, you get yourself a brand new cell phone. It's the same concept with tasers.
Okay, I think it's on. So can you help me understand? So it looks like you've added a program manager half-time, and then you've added a deputy for 28 to 29, but then you're requesting an additional deputy. So you would it put you up to 30?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay.
So currently, this budget, we currently have 30 deputies in our office.
Okay.
This budget reflects 29 because we had to cut the one.
mhm,
The program manager that you see was a reclassification of an existing record supervisor. And so we split her position between the jail and patrol to supervise our support services division, which is our records staff and our civil staff. That position is partially funded through some of the absorption of the previous program manager in the jail that has retired, that we've now absorbed that funding. So what we're asking for is if we were to do status quo today, have 30 deputies assigned to the patrol division, but this budget only accounts for 29.
okay, that's super helpful, because I was like, it says you have 28, and I apologize that I couldn't keep track of how many you had.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So I think the only other thing I'd point out here, and I don't know, Ken, and you tell me if Public Works has already addressed this or not, but I've heard through the grapevine through Public Works that our motor pool is a little bit upside down because of the cost of increase in fuel. You'll see in this particular budget, we budgeted it's on page 77, 780.05. That internal transfer for motor pool accounts for all of our vehicles and the service and maintenance and the fuel costs. That budget right now is at 518,138. That's what was projected by Public Works back in February. I don't know if that number has changed extremely, or if it has increased, or if they're planning on making any changes in this. But I do know and understand that fuel costs and cost of maintenance is going through the roof right now. The other issue that we're dealing with is the fact that we had ordered and had placed orders for new Dodge Durangos, which is the patrol vehicle. Dodge is pretty much the only outfit in town that provides a patrol vehicle. They have the Chargers and then the Durangos. Chevrolet has an SUV, but their price point is way too high, so we don't even consider them. But about 6 months ago or 3 months ago, Dodge came out and said, yeah, we're cutting all of the state bid contracts across the state because we can't keep up with demand in the private sector. So they canceled all the orders statewide. For us, that was 4 vehicles. You have some counties that had 25 to 30 vehicles on order, all been cut off. We thankfully were able to find 4 somewhere in Illinois or Indiana, had them shipped over here. So we have 4 new cars, but with no anticipated date of when they're going to turn that back on for us. So our motor pool as a whole already, knowing that there's increase in costs and fuel revenue or fuel costs, maintenance, and the fact that we aren't going to be able to get any vehicles for at least the next year and a half, we're going to have to meet as a command team to kind of think about how we operate our fleet and what does that mean for us for our patrol division. How can we conserve on fuel? How do we conserve on mileage driven on vehicles? How do we maintain our fleet? We currently have take-home car policy, which means that every deputy that lives within the county has a car assigned to them and they take it home. There are several benefits to that, but the one negative is that in essence, their drive time from their house to here is on the county dime. And so I need to look at that to determine, am I getting enough of a benefit from their ability to respond immediately when they're in the car versus the fuel savings and the cost savings, if that's something that we need to look at. So it's just now come to us. We're starting to look at it. We still only budgeted 518 in here. I'm sure that Mark is going to keep us apprised as things move forward. And as costs continue to increase, we'll continue to keep an eye on that because we are probably one of the largest, if not the largest, probably real close to Public Works on fleet and fuel costs.
Sheriff, is that benefit or policy part of a CBA or is that just
No.
separate?
It's just not, it's a benefit that we offer. It's not a negotiated benefit. It's something that we've had for years, but we're one of a handful of counties across the state that offer that. Typically what you'll see for fleet is you'll have policies where any type of special assignment, so your detectives, your canine handlers, they would have a take-home car. Any of your supervisors that are required to respond 24/7 have take-home cars. But then your plain deputies that are just getting in the car, coming to work, would share vehicles and they'd pick up a vehicle someplace else. Our take-home car policy doesn't necessarily allow you to take a vehicle out of county unless you're a special assignment. So the deputies who live outside of the county, up in the north end, for example, they park their cars at the police department in Newburgh. It's a program that we've had for years. It's what attracts a lot of people to our agency. A lot of agencies are trying to find ways to go that route. For the life of the vehicle, you're saving money over time because you don't put as much wear and tear on your vehicles. There's all sorts of reasons as to why, but given the position that we're in right now, and not knowing where we're going to get our next patrol car, we may have to look at what that looks like moving forward as a temporary fix, just until we can get our in a position, because we can't put 160, 170,000 miles on a car and not have a replacement available.
Mhm.
And so if we can take our existing fleet and the 4 that we've purchased and try to find a way to spread that out over time and put a little bit of miles on a lot of cars and spread that out, then that might be an option for us.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions on patrol? It's a lot to digest, and I will be here tomorrow, so in case you guys need to ask any follow-up questions. All right, so on to 1069, which is page 79. This is our narcotics forfeiture. As we explained earlier, you'll see at 350.05, which is listed as narcotics forfeiture, we placed a $60,000 placeholder there just for the anticipated monies that are going to come in from that team. The revenue that you see up above that are beginning balances for state civil, federal civil, and state judgment, those are all funds that are the very last amounts of forfeiture dollars that we had in that fund from our previous interagency narcotics team. And so the goal is to continue to try to spend that down. And as soon as we can zero that part out, then we won't have any more reporting requirements on those. But with the narcotics forfeiture line with the new marijuana team, the plan is to still run those forfeiture dollars through this particular account because it's cleaner and it's already set up for all the reporting requirements for forfeiture requirements. Any questions about 1069?
Chair.
Yes.
Sheriff, that, sorry, I have to get down here to see it. That restitution payments, that's just a pass through, correct?
Yeah, I think restitution would, yeah, I'm trying to figure out, I don't even know. Oh, yeah, so if there's a court fee that's charged and it has to go through some sort of restitution, we get a percentage that comes through the state. And so, as you can see, we traditionally don't get any of that. We have year-to-date $80 that have come in. So it's not a big dollar amount, but yeah, we have it in there just because. We don't budget anything in it because we typically
Okay.
don't see money coming through.
Okay, thank you.
This is Doreen App. I have a quick question on the entry for other expense where historically there hasn't been an entry. And it's sizable, it's 55,000. Do you have some idea of what might constitute this line item as it's being spent?
Yeah, so that 55 was added in there to offset the anticipated expense of the revenue of 60,000 coming in for narcotics forfeiture. So we put it in there as a placeholder for 55,000. I believe the other 5,000 is accounted for in our motor pool in the internal expense transfer to the DA's office for forfeiture prosecution. So they're just placeholders so that if we do get that 60,000 in, then we can charge it to that other expense line. But that other expense line won't be charged if we don't have the revenue come in.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My only question was, what are you limited on what you can spend that on? Does it have to go back to somewhere else?
Yeah,
Okay.
so the depending on how it comes through, what particular, whether it's a federal forfeiture or a state civil forfeiture, once we've deemed what it is, then each one of those forfeitures has restrictions on how you can spend it. But majority of it can be spent on training. It can be spent on equipment. We operate under the same guidelines right now under our existing forfeiture. So we pay for a lot of the equipment for like the laptops. We pay for the cell phone expense. We have a machine that we use for Cellbrite that downloads phones for narcotics investigations. We pay for the service for that subscription typically through forfeiture dollars. So there's a list of things we can spend it on. And so we use that money to offset some of our other expenses in some of our lines.
Great. Thank
The
you.
one big one that we can't spend it on is personnel.
Okay.
Which is unfortunate. All right. So moving on to 1086. This is our court security line, which is page 80. This one is actually doing really well, primarily because of two things. One, when the courts were pretty much closed and shut down, and we were having issues with maintaining staff in our jail, we had budgeted for a third court security deputy to go up there with the anticipation of removing the reserves altogether as they retired and moved on. So a couple of things have happened. One, we're able to finally add that third deputy up there. So now you do have a third deputy assigned to court security, primarily because we know the courts are starting to kick back up. But we also have in the 404 1.8, we still have that 30,000 listed there for reserves, primarily because we still have two that continue to work. They haven't retired yet. And the plan is as soon as they do retire, then we just won't backfill those positions. So the budget can still hold and operate and be good with that 30,000 budgeted, but it's only spent when those individuals are currently working. But right now, with the 3 deputies plus a supervisor assigned up there, they're able to staff pretty much most of court security with very little help from reserves. So that's it for court security. All right. On to 10-163, which is the radio system. This one starts on page 81. So as you know, we were had finalized our site review and assessment of the countywide system. Communications Northwest put together that report, provided to you on the various options that we have. We continue to work with the stakeholders and the other users to have conversations about what that might be looking like. What we're doing for the rest of this fiscal year, and we're going to be budgeting for, which is accounted for in here for next fiscal year, has to do with a continued consulting with that particular organization to further digest that report and work with our users on exactly what do we need. So they gave us a very high level. If you're going to replace the entire system, bring it up to speed of new digital equipment and replace all the tower sites, it's going to cost, $5.3 million. Well, that's the very high level piece. The next step is to get the users, the fire agencies, law enforcement into a room with the consultant and actually start to delineate out, okay, you put in here for this, but we really don't need that. We really just need to be able to do this, which is going to change that number. So once we can identify exactly what that specific need is based off the user work and the other consulting, then we'll have a better idea of what that number actually looks like. And then we can start having conversations about what do we need to do moving forward. In addition to that, a large, the only revenue for the most part that comes into this comes directly as a pass-through through YCOM's budget. So all the users who pay dues into YCOM, a percentage of that just gets passed through to us. We currently are getting $270,300 a year from YCOM. I've built into this budget $300,000 because we know that we're going to be increasing that. It will probably likely be more than that based on the conversations with the director. And in essence, that is the YCOM users' fee that they're paying for the system. Then that money comes into this line and then we pay for the monthly maintenance of it. The one major change you're going to see in this particular budget is we freed up some of the ending balance that we've been saving over the last 3 or 4 years for a future build out. And we added in the 801-23 line, $500,000 for a capital line. That's primarily just a placeholder for a possible improvement of one piece of the system. Part of that review identified the fire paging system, which is an antiquated system. When someone calls 911 and they need to send notice to the fire station to dispatch the ambulance or the fire truck, it's sent out over a paging system. A lot of the agencies still have old time pagers that will key up and tell you what's going on. That system and the guts of that and the backbone need to be replaced. It's way end of life. It's on its last leg, and it's roughly $350,000 to $400,000 in a price tag. So we've freed up $500,000 in this line so that as we continue to work with the consultant and we further identify that need and we work with the fire agencies, as soon as we identify what that project looks like, then we can put out an RFP, get that project moving forward and hopefully have that implemented and paid for out of this budget in the next fiscal year. So that's that on the radio system. All right, dog control. 82, page 82. I'm gonna knock on wood because this has not been an issue for like at least a year or two, and I don't know why. I typically really enjoy coming in and talking about the dog control budget. This year, I can actually say that with a straight face. Here is the official memo, Ken, that the Hewitt Junior Trust annual report. If you guys want to take that, this is the actual memo that we're required to every year through that trust to hand to the board. Basically, what it outlines is that, as always, the only money that we're spending out of that trust account is the $30,000, which is the dog control kennel license with Homeward Bound. That trust dollar amount, which was originally close to almost $400,000 that was given to the county through dog control, was restricted to be spent only on the care and maintenance of dogs. So the only thing we can identify in this budget that truly just meets that need is the dog kennel contract. So this particular year, we have a beginning balance, which is that 30115 line that shows 193,251. That's the trust amount that will be carried over at the end of this fiscal year. And that's minus the $30,000. So our year to date is at 223,251. Subtract the 30,000 and it will begin with 193,251. And then of course, the same concept in the next fiscal year, which will be another memo that you'll receive next year, will show that we will use that $30,000 for that. The other piece that I would like to point out is, for the most part, Homeward Bound's processing a lot of licenses. They're doing a lot of work for us. The contract seems to go really good. We have the system set up that if it's a non-county license that comes in, so if it's City of McMinnville or City of Newburgh, that Homeward Bound will still process that license. But we made arrangements that 75% of that fee goes back to the city because they are in essence doing dog control on their own in the cities. We don't provide that for them anymore. And then 25% of that fee stays with us. And so I was doing some real rough numbers in my head this week when I was finalizing this to talk to you guys. And we're probably right about anywhere between $7,000 to $8,000 away from actually breaking even on our licensing. So the total number of dollars that are coming in each year for licensing, we're about 8,000 short to be able to fund this program moving forward with all of our expenses until the trust runs out. Once the trust funds run out, then we would be roughly 38,000 short. So that's good news. The good news is that for the most part, the amount of dogs that are being licensed and the amount of revenue coming in for that, as this program is being ran currently, is in essence almost paying for itself. So we're in a very somewhat stable position. We will have to, at some point when that trust funds runs out, come up with a conversation of how we're going to fund that kennel. But that thankfully could be several years down the road at this rate. So that's all I got to say about dogs. Okay. All right. So then the next one is our 4041, it's page 84. So traditionally, I have a big memo that I hand to you guys with all these projects that we're looking at doing in the jail. We didn't present one this year for two reasons. One, there's not very much money in this budget, so there's not very many projects we can do. Two, most of the work that we're continuing doing right now is already just being picked up by maintenance. So what you'll see in this capital improvement fund is the biggest expense that gets coded to this every year is our maintenance contract for the Siemens for the camera upgrade that we had in the facility.
Just for clarification, if you go back to the behind the jail budget on, you'll see it, it's out of order, but 4041 is immediately behind the jail budget. It has a page number at 84. So if you go to the Marine tab, the Marine Patrol tab, it's immediately in front of that.
All right, in there. Thank you. Again.
Okay,
I knew
sorry.
it was somewhere around there.
So we have money that comes into this through 1145, And then that money goes back out to the county to pay for the loan for the camera system upgrade. So that's the in and out on the revenue that you'll see for the internal transfers. And then the remaining of the balance sits in there, basically pays for the yearly maintenance cost for that particular camera system. So if and when we ever were to come up with a very large capital project, which we've had at times where we've had needs for a large purchase, then that's where we would typically try to project that out. I believe previously the concept of having a memo come through that's approved every year by the budget committee was closely tied to the fact that we were having hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in revenue every year from Benton County. And that the time the board wanted to make sure that we weren't just blowing that money on other things. So I didn't have any memo to present because we don't have any projects to propose this year, but I would advocate probably moving forward, trying to find a way to work with Ken and county maintenance to come up with a new process for those type of needs. And whether it's just a conversation on a regular basis through the commissioner liaison and what we're looking at doing for improvements, and then just build the budget every year around that. But I'll have to have conversations with Ken about that further because we didn't have time to address it this year.
The only other addition, or just a reminder I'd point out too, you have the 1145 funds that are coming in that are paying the interfund loan, from Jessica's budget, but then also the board that was new for this fiscal year approved an annual allocation of discretionary funds of $100,000 going into this. So you'll also see that reflected in here as well, that allocation continued.
Yeah.
So.
So any questions on 4041? All right. So the last budget is going to be 1040, which is our emergency management, and it starts on page 111. And what you're going to see here is we have a very healthy ending balance or beginning balance that we're going to be starting with. You'll see that our year to date also is pretty healthy. A lot of what happened during COVID is the state of Oregon, obviously, a lot of the emergency management teams across the state and emergency managers were significantly an integral part of the deployment of PPE to communities assisting in public health with testing sites and stuff, all related to the COVID pandemic. And so as the state was receiving funds through the OEM, they were redistributing those funds out to county programs. So for our program, for example, they were able to send us some additional funds to help pay for some of our personnel that was specifically spent, their time was spent dealing directly with COVID related issues. So our typical allotment of funds that we get from the state is $90,000. That number stays the same. But last year we were able to see a significant increase in that. That would, in essence, assisted in having a good, healthy ending balance. And other than that, not much major changes with this. We still have a little bit of exterior work that they're completing on, which is paid for through the grant that we got through, and it's all done through the capital fund. So you don't see any of that work in here. But Joe's team has done a really good job of with that transition and removing everything from the assessor's office and the clerk's building out to the new EOC. They're going to install a new radio antenna for our Aics, and then they're going to put up some additional fencing. But once they get through all that, pretty much that entire facility will have been renovated and good to go. It's got a nice new paint job. My daughter refers to it as the grape building. Yep. When we drive by it, so it looks like grapes. So I guess it goes with our wine theme of Yamhill County. Other than that, it's doing really well. They continue to work pretty hard out there. They have a small amount of staff. There's only 2 of them, but they continue to work. And Brian, who's a sergeant with our office, who's our emergency manager, still works on some statewide teams. He represents our county very well, and he does a really good job of advocating for what we might need. With the OEM changing and being removed out from underneath the military department and becoming their own group, that will be an interesting transition. But as of right now, we've seen it actually be a benefit to us. It makes it a little bit easier for us to get access to things that we need through the emergency management. So that's it for EM, unless you guys have any questions.
No, actually, no. So were the cameras able to be installed this year since last year
The cameras in the jail?
in the jail?
Yeah, its system's up and running completely. We've had some growing pains with some issues with some of the DVRs and servers, but thankfully we were able to get most all of it installed before they had any major supply issues.
That's good.
I've heard from a lot of counties that are in the process of putting in the exact same program. They're having issues getting the equipment because they're just not able to purchase them. And the ones that they can get their hands on are on the no-buy list from the federal government. So
What about the switchboard? If I remember
the
right,
control panel,
Control
that's all, yep, that's all been
to resolve all
switched.
the safety issues and
Yeah, there's a few that they're still kind of working on. The one that we're still trying to facilitate is getting it all in one position. Right now, the way the station's set up, they still have this station and they have one over here. We're working on operationally, we're going to be looking at some ideas moving forward on possibly assigning 2 people in the control room. One to control the doors and one to actually monitor cameras. But it would be an internal staffing change and procedure, but something that we're looking at trying to move forward, and we'll continue to have conversations moving forward.
well, it's good to hear.
Before we start putting away binders, and I know we're ready to wrap, but there's still one more budget in the criminal justice that we do have to go over really briefly. And it's on, you'll see a tab for dispatch. It's immediately before emergency management.
Okay.
I don't know if I'll need the full 3 minutes that the sheriff left me. No, I'm
Hey,
just kidding.
I tried. I tried.
Generous buffer.
No, I'm just kidding. So this is really quick. So Fund 1048, this is what the county pays for our YCOM dues. And so this is all straight out of the general fund, except for whatever savings. You'll see a little bit of a beginning balance because the actual renewal for the dues that was approved by YCOM was less than what we had budgeted. So it's a little bit of a carryover. And so this is a placeholder, and we adjust that because as we're working with YCOM and going through that renewal process, they're trying to adopt their budget and their dues for the next fiscal year along the same line, running parallel while we're adopting budget. So this is a number that's a placeholder for those dues, and it's straight out of the general fund that pays for that. So any questions?
Does that reflect how they were talking about reconstructing the way they do the dues?
No, that this reflects this as a number that's in here as a placeholder, and when YCOM finalizes their budget and comes out with those final numbers on the dues, then that's what the actuals would be charged against this. But there's sufficient appropriation authority here that no matter what that budget looks like to be able to cover that. So any cost savings realized from that, we have a couple options. Actually, for, the sheriff mentioned earlier with 1043 and the struggles with some of that budget, this was one of those funds where we did have some cost savings, that we didn't require the full allocation, and we made some adjustments to the discretionary allocation where we reduced this and moved it to 1043 to help lessen that impact and limit what the add back request looks like. That's going to be before the committee tomorrow. So
Thank you.
that was
Thanks,
it.
Sheriff.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you guys tomorrow morning.
Yeah, don't go anywhere because I want to see that thing that you have about
Oh,
voting.
I'll give it to you if you want to.
You have two of those?
I only have one.
Oh, you guys.
You
They
can
could
take
only-
a
they
picture of
We'll
it.
take a picture.
They could only
Yeah.
afford one.
Wow.
Okay, so we have a lunch available to pick up in the Oak Room, and
So we'll recess until 1:30.
yes.